Great. Well, it's great to be here. I'm going to get out of the light. I think I can't hide from it, though, actually. Okay, so this is work with Jim Stock. Some of you probably have seen this before. This is a paper that we wrote for an ECB conference in June in Portugal, and Jim was there. I didn't see it, so I figured I'd give it here, see what it was all about. We'd hope to make some more progress on this before I got here, but we haven't. So it's the same stuff. So here's the issue. It's a pretty simple. This is really quite a simple paper. It's really a paper. It's a paper about trying to reverse engineer something. Am I okay? Okay. Am I okay? Everything's okay. You look pensive here. Okay. So here's the story, right? I'm sorry. I'm going to look at the paper has some data on inflation and various slack measures, real economic sort of business cycle indicators for the United States and for Europe. Here in this talk, I'm just going to look at the U.S. data. Okay, I'm not going to look at the European data, and there's nothing from Chile or other countries. Okay, so I'm just going to look at the U.S. data, and I guess what we've learned, from some of the other talks is some of the puzzles in the U.S. appear in other, or some of the issues in the U.S. appear in other countries as well, too. So hopefully there's something interesting here, or more general than just the U.S. But anyway, so here's the story, right? So here's the unemployment rate in the United States from 2010 to this is through the second quarter of 2018, and the unemployment rate has fallen from 10 to below 4, right? So a big change in the unemployment rate. What's happened to inflation? Well, not a whole heck of a lot. The blue line here is headline inflation. So this is headline PCE, personal consumption expenditures, right? And the and the red is core. So that's excluding food and energy in this particular sector, right? And so that's there doesn't seem to be a negative correlation, right, or between these things, right? So that's the puzzle. So here's another way of saying the same puzzle. This is just a regression, right? So so on the x-axis we have the unemployment gaps. This is the unemployment rate minus the CBO's estimate of the natural rate, and then we have on the vertical axis we have the four-quarter inflation. The four-quarter inflation rate, right, for the U.S. The four-quarter difference in that, right? So it's the annual difference in annual inflation, right? And you can see, if you just ran a regression, right, in the early period. You'd get the blue line. In the middle period, you get the orange line, and in the later period, you get the green line, right? So it looks like the slope of this thing, right, is changing, right? So that's the question, right? So I guess I can say what we're going to do, going back to this picture. It's sort of reverse engineering. So we're going to ask, right, in this paper, pretty simply, suppose we did some kind of reasonable things to the black line, right? Could we make this thing change, right? Could we get a different correlation? Or going here, right? Suppose we change the activity measure. Could we somehow make this thing look more stable, right? And the answer is going to turn out to be no. Or not very much, right? And then we're going to ask, well, suppose we change the inflation measure. Right? Can we get anything out of that? And the answer is going to be, yeah, maybe some, right? So that's so x-axis no, y-axis little something. Okay, so that's what the paper's about. That's what the paper does. Okay, so that's it. Okay. So that's what this says. Okay, and the way we're going to do it, I should say, the way we're going to change the y-axis, the way we're going to change inflation is we're going to look at, PC, we're going to look at different sectors. So we're going to look at, the price of shirts and shoes, right, and gasoline and housing services and medical services, right? And we can look at each of those separately, right, and see if there are some sectors, right, some components of the PCE that, are more cyclically sensitive, are more stably, highly correlated with the slack measure than others, right? And we're going to ask why you might expect that, right? And the answer there is going to be pretty clear, right? If you've got, traded goods, right? Maybe they're not going to react to domestic things that go on in the U.S. economy. U.S. economy is pretty big, as it turns out, so that kind of holds a little weight, but not a lot, right? And then it turns out, in the U.S., some of our price measures, are really pretty lousy, right? So they're very noisy, right? They're not very good measures. So, if they're pretty lousy measures, it's not surprising maybe that they're not moving around a lot, right, when other things are, right? I mean, real market prices might be moving, but we just don't measure them well, right? So those are going to be the two stories, I guess, right? And then we'll sort of take these sectors, that seem to be, pretty highly correlated with activity, and we'll average them, right? And we'll get, something that's an index of inflation using these particular sectors that seem to be, most highly correlated, with real activity. Okay, so the data is quarterly, and we're going to look at 4-quarter inflation, so PT minus PT minus 4, right? And then often what we're going to do is, we're going to first difference this, but we'll look at year-over-year changes. Okay, so those are the data. Okay, so, let's just go back to the outline here. So the first thing, can you, this is one of Jim's slides, so he uses words like resuscitate, right? So can we resuscitate, right, the Phillips curve by using different measures of activity, slack measures, right? The answer is going to be no. Let me show you, we look at about, 15 of these, right? So you might expect, right, there are lots of, discussion, right, in the U.S., if you look at the unemployment rate of the last 10 years has moved, but, the recession was really severe, and the pool of people who are unemployed are different than they are in typical recession, so maybe the unemployment rate, right, isn't the best indicator. Maybe we want to use something like, a short-term unemployment rate or something like that. Might be more reasonable, right? Maybe we want to look at an employment to population ratio, or maybe an employment to population ratio for certain, groups, age groups, 25 to 54, prime age. Maybe we want to look at, a GDP gap or something like that, or maybe we want to look at capacity utilization, right? Later on, we'll talk about, if we're looking at these gap things, right, how do you compute the center of the gap, right? Some of these are CBO measures, right, but maybe you could use some time series methods, right, some smoothing methods, and also compute those, right? So here are, I guess there's 8 of them there, right? You can see they kind of move together, but they're different enough, right, that maybe, some of this can potentially be explained by them, right? So I showed you data, from here, 2010 to 2018, right? And these measures behave a little differently over that period. So maybe there's something there. There's a black line that going through this, which is kind of an average of those, actually a principal component, right? And so you might think about we have multiple measures, so maybe we're just going to average these guys. Okay, well, you can convince yourself, I think, very quickly, that this isn't going to explain the story, right? Just, do some scatter plots, if you will, or some correlations for all these different measures, and you see the same phenomenon, right? You see this flattening, right? Regardless of the measure of economic activity that you use. These are all going to be Phillips correlation, so this is just going to be the correlation between this yearly difference in yearly inflation, right, against a 4-quarter moving average of a variety of these slack measures. So here's the number, right, there's the scatter plot that we saw at the beginning, the unemployment gap, right, the correlations fall in the early period from about a half to about, a tenth now, and if you look at, the slope of that, of those 3 lines, right, that were plotted, right, they went from, pretty steep to pretty flat, okay? And if you look across this, right, you sort of see that everywhere, right? The correlation, the details differ, right? But you see the same thing across all of these, right? Okay, so that's that. Okay, so you know that kind of doesn't do it. Let me show you in. I'm going to start doing some work now, looking at the inflation measures, where we're going to get some action, I think, or more than zero action. We got zero action here, right? And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some sectors. I'm going to look at prices from some sectors of consumer goods, right, and ask whether those are correlated with activity. So I need to tell you what activity measure I'm going to use to do those calculations, okay? So here's what we use in the body of the paper. So here are, you know, here's the short-term unemployment rate, the employment rate. These are both inverted, right? Employment to population ratio, employment capacity utilization, and gross domestic output, geometric average of GDP and GDI in the United States, the income measure, and the expenditure measure. Those are all plotted there, standardized and plotted, right? And then, you know, average those guys or average them in some sort of, you know, slightly more complicated way, compute a principal component, right? And that's the black thing, right? So what we're going to do in the body of the work is we're going to use this black measure. Everything here, I guess I should say, we're interested in cyclical activity, right? So we've taken these data and we've filtered them, right, to highlight what's going on over the business cycle, 6 to 32 quarters. So we've done, we've done sort of bandpass filtering on these to eliminate trends, right, low frequency stuff, and to average out noise. Okay, so that's what we have here, right? And you can see these guys kind of look the same, but they kind of look different, right? So this black thing is going to be our activity measure. I'll talk a little later on about robustness, so to speak, of our results, right? What happens if you change the black thing to something else? You use the blue thing or the red thing, or you don't do a bandpass thing, you do a this or that or this or that, right? And as it turns out, not much is going to change. Okay. So now, this is the way, okay, so you could break down the goods that go into the PCE in the United States. You can break them down pretty finely, right? We're only going to break them down into these 17 categories. We use these, and these are the shares. These are the shares, average shares over the last 10 years, okay? So you can see, a housing is important, right, 16%. You can see healthcare probably is important. Yeah, okay, good. Healthcare is important, 16%. Less important things, financial consumption expenditures of nonprofit institutions serving households, right? So these are things like religious services, right? That's a consumption good. Okay? So interestingly, we're going to have to measure the market price of that, right? That's kind of hard. I'm sorry, maybe, anyway. Okay, so that's that. That's only 3%, 2.8%. Okay, great, okay. So in other work, Jim and I looked at, we were interested in other work in thinking about forecasting future headline PCE or aggregate PCE, right? Are thinking about the trend value of inflation in the United States, right? The trend value is something you might expect to continue into the future. And in that work, what we did is, you could just look at inflation, aggregate inflation, and forecast that, right? Or you could think about forecasting aggregate inflation, but using, right, this aggregated information. And we found it was pretty useful to sort of break things up. These different, sectors tell you different things about the future, right? So that turned out to be pretty useful work. They have sort of different properties. And so this little exercise is to ask, not do they have different forecasting ability, do they have different information about trends, right? The long run level of inflation, right? But, are they correlated differentially with economic activity? So are they different indicators of slack in the economy? Okay. Okay, so you're faced with okay, so as I said, there are reasons, clear reasons why you think, right, maybe they might behave differentially. One is, some of these sectors have more traded goods than others, right? And the other, some of these sectors, the prices are not measured very well. In other sectors, they're measured very well. So here, right, religious services, right, we don't measure the price of that very well. Okay, so like getting back to what Bart was talking about, right? So how do we measure this? The wages we pay to ministers or priests, right? So that's the way that's measured. Okay, there's some other sectors here. I guess I should talk about them. I got recreation goods and vehicles. Okay, so that's when you say that. That sounds a lot like, tennis rackets and RVs, trailers, right? Stuff that you could measure market prices, in baseballs and basketballs and stuff like that, right? That's right, but it also has home computers in it and Xboxes and stuff like that. It turns out, right, those goods are changing a lot, right? So it turns out that's a sector, right, where a lot of the important action comes from this new consumer electronics that's measured very poorly because of new goods issues, okay? Some of these sectors are measured pretty well, gasoline and other energy goods, fine. Food and beverages purchased for off-premises consumption, those are the prices at grocery stores, right? So we measure that stuff pretty well, okay? Some stuff we measure, some of it pretty well and some of it pretty poorly. Healthcare, right? The sort of components that go into our consumer price index, right? So that's measured by, what consumers pay out of pocket, right? In the United States, we pay out of pocket when we buy Advil, ibuprofen at the drugstore, so that's fine, right? And when we go to our doctors and we make our little co-payments, $10 for my annual checkup, right? So that part is measured well, right? But the amount of but what goes into the PCE in contrast to what goes into the CPI in the United States, right, is the price of my checkup at the doctor, right? So that's my $10 copay, but also what the doctor receives from my insurance company, right? And that's negotiated between those guys, right? And when I go in, when I had my hip replaced, right, there were all of these, I paid a little bit, right, and my insurance company had negotiations with the, Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, and they worked out, right? So all of those things turn out to be less well measured, right? Those things turn out to be less well measured, and measured, a lot of that's measured by, the wages of doctors and things like that, right? The kinds of things that Bart was talking about. So what you can do, and so that's what this says, right? So what you can do, and Jim did this, is you can go through this stuff like sector by sector, and you can, read detail about, right, how it's computed, right? And you can talk to people who know stuff, right? Because there are people that are experts in this, right? And what Jim did is went through all of these sort of sector by sector and wrote down what's good, what's measured well, what's measured poorly, et cetera. Took a bunch of notes. Those are in the paper, right? And, in the paper, if you look at the appendix, right, you can kind of see, some little notes on each of these different sectors. So this is a fun sector. This is actually measured well. This is food and beverages for off-premises consumption, food at grocery stores. Turns out to be measured well, right? It's got some interesting things for it, right? Notice the volatility in the early period, right, is much higher than the later period. Okay. It's kind of interesting, right? In the United States, when we think about core inflation, ex-food and energy, right? Why did people start leaving food out? Well, because of all of this volatility back here, right? If you think about, what's been going on the last 20 years? It's not very volatile, right? So it should really be back in core. Okay, so you can go through all of these. Turns out housing is one of these things. Housing services are reasonably well estimated, right? We've got surveys of rental units of different types. they're nicely done with rotating panels, et cetera. And so this turns out to be measured reasonably well, at least in the last 35 years or so. Okay, so again, you can sort of go through, you can just hear healthcare is okay. Financial services, you can see, right? So a big part of financial services is, the value of some financial services that are provided without payment, right? Like financial services from keeping money in a checking account. Probably some people still do that. I still do that, but maybe no one else does, right? I earn zero interest on that, right? So what's the value of the services I'm getting? It's the foregone interest. So, right, so what do the price guys do, right? They try and figure out the foregone interest, right? And you can see, right, that I guess that foregone interest was pretty smooth here, right? And was pretty wild there, right? They kind of changed the method, right, that they used for estimating this. Okay, so fine. So you can go through these one at a time. And here's one. Clothing, right? Okay, so I didn't know this. So when Jim did this, he said clothing is like personal computers. It's like new electronics and consumer goods. And I said, well, that's weird, right? And he said, well, Mark, that's because you're wearing the same suit, right, that you bought 20 years ago and the same shoes you bought 25 years ago. There are a lot of people who these things turn over every year, right? And right? And chaining all that stuff in turns out to be hard. So as it turns out, clothing and footwear, right, is like PCs, right? There are major new good products associated with that. I wouldn't think they're new goods, right? But they are new goods, okay? Okay, so you can do all of this, right? And what you get out of this, and this, we're not going to really use that. We're going to use some of this in the analysis, right? But we're not going to use all of this in the analysis, is you can sort of categorize these things usefully, and to help sort of thinking about the results we're going to look at in just a few minutes, right, into some sectors where these things are measured pretty well, right? Some sectors where things are measured like sort of okay, right? Healthcare, right? Some things are measured well here, some things aren't, right? And some things that aren't measured very well, right? This is religious services, right? Clothing, right? This is fire, right? And this is recreational goods, right? PCs, if you will. Okay, so now life is pretty simple, right? Let's just take all of these, inflation rates, right, for these sectors, right? Again, 4-quarter change in 4-quarter inflation, right? And look at the correlation between those and this activity measure, right? And you can see, right, sure enough, right, there's different correlations, right? So, food services and accommodations, these are restaurants and hotels, right? It turns out, right, inflation in those sectors are pretty highly correlated with economic activity. So is food and beverages, right? So is housing, right? Those are all well-measured sectors, right? And they're pretty highly correlated. This is using, bandpass versions, business cycle, smooth versions of these inflation measures, and you see roughly the same thing there. Okay, so great. So we got differential correlations. So then, you run a regression. Okay, so that's what we're going to do here, right? So this is what we do. So we've got this cyclical activity index, right? And we want to ask, gee, is there some weighted average, right? Let's choose a weighted average of these inflation measures. Again, 4-quarter change is a 4-quarter inflation, right? Let's choose some weights so we have a weighted average of inflation so that weighted average of inflation is as highly correlated as possible, right, with this measure of real activity, right, which is sort of cyclical activity, right? So we're going to find some WIs, right, to maximize the correlation. We'll then form an index, right? So this is the cyclically sensitive inflation index, right, where we've chosen the weights in this particular way. right? So that's all there are. I guess we want these weights to be non-negative and sum to 1, so it looks like, it looks like a weighted average. Okay, so, if you start doing this, right, you kind of wonder how special, we made some, so what do? We're looking at a particular Y, particular measure of activity. We're looking at inflation constructed in a particular way, 4-quarter difference of 4-quarter inflation, right? You might ask, gee, are the results dependent on that stuff, right? And the answer is no, right? So I'm not going to show you the results, but you can look at alternative measures of alternative time series filters that you apply to inflation, right? You could take the various elements that went into Y, GDO, employment, unemployment, et cetera. You could handle them in different ways. You could put all of them in to this analysis and form a weighted average of economic activity that's as highly correlated as possible with a weighted average, right, of these inflation measures. So you got 2 sets of W's, right, and ask what happens. You could add leads and lags of this stuff, right, and ask what happens, and you kind of get the same results, okay? So none of these, this is kind of the simplest version, but you can see exactly what's going to happen from this. Okay, boom. Well, this is what happens when you do this, right? These are these correlations that I showed you before, right? This is, what happens when you compute those W's. So those weights in the weighted average are the numbers in the right column. In our sort of benchmark model, we left out the sectors where, the prices were junk, poorly measured, I think they're called, okay? So we just left those out, right? We set those equal to 0. Turns out you could put them in and estimate them and ask what are their values. Turns out to be 0, okay? So this is a constraint that really doesn't bind, but it made sense to impose it, right? So what do you see? Well, interestingly, right, you see you're putting a lot of weight on housing, right? And on, so housing had a weight, right, a share in the PCE of about 17%. It's going to get about 60% of this weight, right? And, you got a bunch of weight on food and some on recreational services, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what does this guy look like? Here's the black thing that's plotted there. Okay, the black curve. Oh, I'm sorry. And we did this estimation post-1984. Post-1984 because, when we looked at some of these inflation measures, right, the way they were measured kind of changed, right, in the mid-'80s, right? So our estimation period, is here, okay? So the black thing there is the change in inflation, this CSI thing, and the blue thing, the blue dash thing is the cyclical component of the unemployment rate, right? And it looks like it's inverted, right? So this measure, right, goes down a lot during recessions, right? So when it goes down, slack goes up. Okay, and what do you see? Well, I don't know, the blue thing and the black thing look kind of correlated here, right? So that's the point, right? We tried to, in some sense, maximize the correlation between those, right? You can look in this early period, take this thing and just run it back, right? You can see they're correlated there, right? And at least to the eye, it's not clear they're more or less correlated here than they are there, right? So there's, some stability, if you will, from this. And again, this is, I don't know, sort of out of sample, right? Because we didn't estimate the weights there. That's the CSI, right? So you see, compared to the headline PCE, which is in blue, or core PCE, which is in red, you can see it behaves, well, somewhat differently, right? You can see somewhat differently, right? It's increased, much more toward the end. I'll show you that, right, in just a second, right? It's got more cyclical variability in it. I guess that was the point, right? Okay. So I'm gonna just, I guess, kind of wrap up with some pictures here, right? So this is where we started, right? This was using core PCE, right? Steep, less steep, flat, right? Now use the PCE. Well, you know, it's not as unstable. Still some instabilities there, right? But that's kind of what we got, right? Now, you know, I don't know, change what you put on the x-axis. So instead of the unemployment rate, put the short-term unemployment rate, right? What do you get? Well, this is what you saw before, right? Again, you saw the flattening here, right? Changing what was on down here didn't matter, right? Here, right, you see somewhat less instabilities, right? So you've gotten a little something out of this, right? These correlations, remember, right, they change pretty dramatically, you know. So this is the same table that I showed you before, right? Correlations over these different periods, right? They changed from, you know, pretty big and negative here to pretty close to zero here, right? You see the changes aren't as big, right? So by focusing on these cyclically sensitive sectors, right, we've reduced, if you will, some of the instability in this Phillips correlation thing, right? And you can see that, you know, in the slopes as well. Okay, so summarizing, pretty easy paper. I mean, easy exercise, right? Try to reverse engineer something to see if you change, you know, regressing y on x. What if and it looks unstable. What if I change y? What if I change x? Right? Can I make it more stable? Right? That's what we've tried to do here. Right? Changing the slack measure doesn't seem to do very much. Cyclical behavior does vary a lot across these sectors. We knew it differed for forecasting reasons, and you know, it also differs here for correlation between what's going on. Variation over the last years. Let me show you this final picture, two final pictures. So this is the picture that I started with, right? And that's the picture that I ended up with. Right here, start, finish. I got 2 minutes left. I'm going to keep doing this. Okay? Okay? But you can see, right, sure enough, right, as the unemployment rate went down, if you will, right, this cyclically sensitive inflation, right, which was running at the beginning of the period, you know, here, right, has increased, right? It's now standing at about 2.7%, right, whereas these headline measures are standing at about 2%. If you compute this trend measure that I talked about, right, so compute some sort of long-run average and using all the data from all of these different 17 sectors, right, and ask where does that stand right now, right? I did the calculation just before I left Princeton, right? It's standing now about 1.7%, right? So that would be kind of a trend value inflation. That's it. That's all I got.
Thank you, Mark, very much for this presentation.